I was curious. I just got a thing that said moderators help everything. Moderators don't do anything. Unless she's hot and goth, then she can do everything. We're going to try to use the Claudie McKee method here. Buried Alive, The Terrifying History of Our Most Primal Fare by Jan Bondeson. I believe we're on chapter 3. Winslow the Anatomist. This thing will work perfect. Thanks, Claude. Winslow the Anatomist and Bruhe, the horror monger. Today is a thought, a fear is tomorrow, and yesterday is our sin and our sorrow. And life is death, where the body's the tomb, and the pale sweet breath is buried alive in its hideous gloom. T. Beddoes, a dirge. The anatomist Jacob Winslow, or is it Jacob Winslow, was born in 1669, the eldest of 13 children of Peter Jacobson Winslow, Dean of the Protestant Church of Our Lady in Odense, Denmark. Winslow entered the University of Copenhagen in 1687 to study theology, but after 4 years switched to anatomy and surgery. He enjoyed no success as a surgeon. However, at one of his first attempts to perform an operation, the sight of the flowing blood alarmed him so much that he determined never, and I say never, again to try any surgical procedure. Such a state of affairs would today have led to his hasty exodus from medical school. But the 17th century Danish professors were more lenient and perhaps also wiser. They advised him to concentrate on the study of anatomy, and fortunately, young Winslow had no qualms about cutting up the dead. As the prosecutor of the able anatomist, the prosector, I should say, of the able anatomist Caspar Bartholin, he made such swift progress that he was awarded a royal grant to travel to Holland and France for further studies. When in 1699 Winslow was studying anatomy in Paris, he was deeply influenced by the Catholic tracts of Jacques Benjamin Bousset. What's up? His spiritual conversion was complete after he met and spoke with Bousset. Winslow converted to Roman Catholicism and changed his name to Jacques Benet Winslow. Winslow was unwilling to return to Protestant Denmark as a Catholic, and Bousset and his other French Catholic benefactors helped him resume his work in Paris. The medical faculty of Copenhagen was one of the finest in Europe in the late 17th century, and Winslow had received a first-rate medical education. Is this him? I believe that's him. It is no coincidence that he rose rapidly in the Parisian medical world. He became physician to several hospitals, a member of the Académie Royale des Sciences, and Doctor Regent of the Paris Faculty of Medicine in 1728. Winslow was also a distinguished anatomist who in 1732 published Exposition anatomique de la structure du corps humain, a worthy treatise on descriptive anatomy that remained in use well into the 19th century. The foramen Winslowy, the hell did they change his name to Winslowy for? The foramen Winslowy, the opening between the greater and lesser sacs of the peritoneum, still bears his name. That's why it was changed. Some contemporaries were of the opinion that in spite of his superior knowledge of anatomy, Winslow remained a credulous, superstitious man. This judgment may well have been based on religious bigotry, however, and is not supported by a study of Winslow's published works which often demonstrate. Do I have the little flashlight on? I do. Both scientific reasoning and a firm critical judgment. In 1743, at the age of 74, Winslow was belatedly promoted to full professor of anatomy at the Jardin du Roi. He held on to this prestigious post until 1758, when extreme deafness forced him to retire at the age of 89. The hardy old Dane died in 1760 without ever seeing his native country again. Jacques Benet, how the hell would you say that? Benet Winslow wrote his anatomical textbook and his articles in the Memories of the Academy of Sciences in French, but all his formal theses at the Faculty of Medicine were in Latin. His thesis, Mort Incertae Signa, published in 1740, was one of those formal academic publications and would have been given little attention had its subject and conclusions not been so startling. Winslow postulated that the signs of death used by the medical profession were unreliable and that people were at immediate risk of being buried alive. The thesis begins with the solemn words, "Death is certain since it is inevitable, but also uncertain since its diagnosis is sometimes fallible." Jacques Benyan Winslow boldly claimed, "It is evident from experience that many apparently dead have afterwards proved themselves alive by rising from their shrouds, their coffins, and even from their graves." He quoted the works of Zacchia and Lancisi discussed in 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 the preceding chapter, and cited the sad cases of the Emperor Zeno, who was willfully locked into a vault, and John Duns Scotus, who was buried alive. Winslow himself added some more recent observations. A certain Madame Landry had told him that her father had once been laid out for dead, but had revived when a woman poured seawater. Jesus Christ, I can't read. But had revived when a woman poured salt water into his mouth, and a clergyman named Joseph Marischal attested that in 1714 he had seen a woman sit up in her fortunately open coffin when the pallbearers passed through Rue Jean Robert in Paris. A more sinister observation was communicated to Winslow by the Paris surgeon M. Bernard. He had been present when the corpse of a monk buried 3 or 4 days earlier was brought out from a church vault after a noise had been heard. The monk was breathing and alive, with his arms lacerated near the swaths employed in securing them. M. Bernard was a respectable medical practitioner, and there is little reason to doubt his veracity. A phenomenon that seems to have worried Winslow even more was the risk that an anatomist might, through a fatal mistake, start dissecting the body of a person falsely diagnosed as being dead, as the great Vesalius was thought to have done. Alerted too late by the still sentient victim's mournful shrieks and cries, upon feeling the pain of the incisions, the anatomist could do nothing but watch the person die by his own handiwork. That lamentable circumstance exposed the unwary operator to eternal infamy and the implacable indignation of the surviving friends. The Paris surgeon Philippe Payou had once performed a cesarean section on the corpse of a woman who turned out to have a spark of life still in her. She had trembled and ground her teeth upon the touch of the scalpel, and this blunder had filled the surgeon's mind with terror. It is difficult not to link Jacques Benin Winslow's horror that one of his cold, insensate subjects in the dissection hall might one day give a scream of pain when the first deep incision was made, the warm, pulsating blood flowing over the hands of the unwary operator, with the known fact that already as a medical student he had a great fear of blood and was incapable of performing surgical operations. That Philippe Apieu had died already in 1706, and that all of Winslow's contemporary cases date before 1714 suggests that he had written his dissertation at about this time, but refrained from publishing it. It certainly had a much more personal tone than the run of the mill medical theses of the time. Winslow passionately warned his colleagues about the dangers of apparent death, premature burial, and premature dissection, and boldly asserted that vast numbers of persons who have been too soon interred probably call aloud from their graves for a due vengeance on those who have laboriously or barbarously exposed them to a violent death. He even claimed that he himself had twice, once as a child and once as an adolescent, been mistakenly laid out for dead and consigned to be buried during his years in Denmark, but fortunately he had revived on both occasions. A later Danish writer made a determined effort to find independent evidence for these occurrences, but without success, although Winslow had written in a letter to his nephew that his health had been very precarious from his childhood until he was 15 years old. The main point of Winslow's thesis was that although the modern surgical tests of death or life were better than the primitive, traditional signs of death used among the people, they were still too uncertain to be relied upon. The onset of putrefaction. Hello, bros. The onset of putrefaction was the only reliable indication that an individual had died. Winslow did not consider the lack of respiratory movement and the absence of arterial pulsations to be infallible signs of death. Only putrefaction and the appearance of livid spots were sure signs that the individual had really expired. He advocated that no lifeless patient who could not be safely diagnosed as dead be shrouded and put into a coffin. Instead, the presumed corpse was to remain in a warm bed and there be vigorously resuscitated. The individual's nostrils were the individual's nostrils were to be irritated by introducing sternutaries, erhines, juices of onions, garlic, and horseradish. They could also be tickled with the quill of a pen, while some preferred thrusting a sharp pointed pencil up the corpse's nose. That's a bright idea. The gums were to be rubbed with garlic, and the skin stimulated by the liberal application of whips and nettles. The intestines could be irritated by the most acrid enemas, the limbs agitated through violent pulling, and the ears shocked by hideous shrieks and excessive noises. Vinegar and pepper should be poured into the corpse's mouth, and where they cannot be had, it is customary to pour warm urine into it, which has been observed to produce happy effects. The corpse that withstood these brutal methods of resuscitation faced even more unpleasant experiences ahead. The soles of the feet should be cut with razors and long needles thrust under the toenails. Whereas Lancisi recommended that a red-hot iron be applied to the soles of the feet, Winslow preferred pouring boiling Spanish wax on the corpse's forehead. A French clergyman suggested that a red-hot poker be thrust up the unfortunate corpse's rear quarters as a last resort. Although these violent and barbarian measures seem ludicrous today, and more worthy of the torture chambers of the Marquis de Sade than the mortuary of a French hospital, Jacques Bennier Winslow was guided solely by his humanitarian feelings. An apparently dead lady who has previously withstood several determined attempts of resuscitation awakes with a shriek. when some careless young people set her bed on fire by mistake. Another illustration in the 1746 English edition of Bruet's book. In spite of its startling contents, Winslow's thesis on the signs of death would have seemed destined first for a short shelf life in the hands of a few academic booksellers, and then for an eternal rest in the sepulchral vaults of selected European university libraries. The quality of these formal academic theses was variable, the editions generally small, and the readership limited to a few medical scientists, most of them within the Paris faculty. But Winslow's thesis caught the eye of the physician and translator Jean-Jacques Bruet de Abrancourt, born in Beauvais in 1685 and educated at the University of Angers. Bruet spent most of his life as a reputable and busy medical practitioner in Paris. Like Winslow, he was a member of the Academy of Sciences and took active part in its transactions. But unlike the Danish anatomist, he was quite unknown in European medical science. Indeed, he had not written a single original medical treatise in his life. Bruet translated a variety of German and Latin books, however, some of them useful medical and obstetrical textbooks, others repositories of amusing anecdotes. These translations show him not only as a skillful linguist and a scholar with considerable understanding of European history and culture, but also as an author with a readable style and, more unusual by mid 18th century standards, an eye for what the reading public wanted. It is likely that Winslow's thesis on the signs of death had caused some stir when it was discussed by the Paris faculty, and Bruet must have realized that he had come on to a good thing. He visited a meeting at the Faculty of Medicine and congratulated Winslow on his thesis. The elderly Dane replied that he had in fact himself tried to have it translated into French, but been displeased with the result. The wily Bruet then introduced himself as a literary man and offered to prepare a superior translation. Winslow, who probably knew about Bruet's earlier work as a translator, readily accepted, little knowing what far-reaching consequences this decision would have in European culture. Although there is no earlier record of Bruet's being in any way concerned about the risk of apparent death and premature burial, in his edition of Winslow's thesis, he emerges as a fully fledged campaigner for burial reform. Is this light still on? Bruet declares himself convinced that putrefaction is the only is the only certain sign of death, that the prevailing routines for declaring people dead are lamentably fallible, and that his fellow Frenchmen are in immediate danger of being buried alive. In a lengthy addition to Winslow's thesis, he elegantly formulates his ambition. As an author, therefore, who is desirous of being universally useful, I shall add to the histories collected by Mr. Winslow, in order to prove the uncertainty of the signs of death, some others whose multiplicity will justify the precautions of the prudent, destroy the vain pretexts of the incredulous, make deeper impressions of the minds of the giddy, and alarm those whose insensibility calls for the most powerful and commanding evidence. To bolster the contents of this slender volume, Bruet also contributed a treatise on the amusing and exotic funerary customs of various tribes around the world, which was in part extracted from one of his earlier translations. Bruyere quoted the miracle of the reviving Cardinal Andreas from Kornmann's De Miraculis Mortuorum, Mortuorum, but scoffed at the credulous historian's interpretation of this as a divine intermission. Corman and Garman had also been at a loss to explain how some dead people could chew and swallow their shoulders in their graves, or how a certain dead woman had begun to devour her own body. These were no miracles or cases of vampirism, Bruyere wrote, but shocking phenomena bred from a despair natural to a person buried alive. Bruyere had found some more credible accounts in a letter from a certain Dr. J. Croft to the chronicler Simone Goulart, who presented several cases of fatal or near fatal mistakes in diagnosing death. One of them concerned Jean de Lavar. Is this leaving marks on this thing? Sure the hell looks like it. A nobleman of Neuchâtel who was brought back to life in his coffin when his physician blew powdered pepper into his nostrils. Another, a young lady in Augsburg, who had been buried in a vault and whose body, with no fingers on the right hand, was found on the stairs of the vault when it was opened some years later. About the year 1730, a poor woman in Saint-Germain had been laid out for dead. Some young people were supposed to wake over her, but they instead diverted themselves with various games and accidentally turned over a wax candle at the foot of her bed. The bedclothes caught fire, and the woman gave a hideous shriek. When recounting a tale of a man who had revived in his coffin when a friend sprinkled his face with holy water, the scoffing Bruyere again wanted to apprise the reader that this effect was produced by the coldness and not the consecration of the water, whose genuine qualities can never be altered by a rhapsody of superstitious words. He even had the audacity to comment that Jesus Christ would never have been capable of raising Lazarus from the dead if the onset of putrefaction had been awaited before the man was declared dead. It is apparent from this rationalist sneering attitude toward religious ritual, which is frequently expressed in Bruyere's books, that he himself was not a practicing Catholic. In his view, the miracles of the resurrected dead in the works of Kornmann and Garman were nothing of the sort, just distressing instances of premature burial. To prove that a person might live for quite a long time in the absence of both heartbeat and respiration, Bruyere quoted some astounding case reports from William Durham's Physico-Theology. The original source was a 1676 thesis written by Professor Johann Nicholas Pechlin, a Swede who had been active at the University of Kiel in Germany. Pechlin had spent much time searching for instances of people being able to survive for considerable periods of time without food or without access to air. Like quite a few other medical men, he was much impressed with the various current stories about fasting girls who claim to subsist for months or even years without taking nourishment of any kind. His most astounding case of a human being surviving underwater was that of Eric Bjornsson, a gardener at Drottningholm Castle outside Stockholm. In the winter of 1646, the gardener had tried to save a drowning man. He valiantly leaped into the ice cold water, but himself got stuck under the thick ice. He survived underwater for 16 hours before being saved by a boatman who thrust a hook into his head with great force and pulled him up alive. The submarine gardener was received in audience by Queen Hedvig Eleonora of Sweden, who examined the mark of the hook in his head and gave him a pension for life. Bjornsson said that the intense cold had made his body completely stiff and insensible, but that the water had been prevented from entering his mouth and nose by a bubble of air. The only sound he had been able to hear under the ice was that of the church bells of Stockholm. This amazing case is well verified by several contemporary Swedish writers who had all met the submarine gardener and heard him tell his story. Some of Pecklin's other stories were less trustworthy. However, a Swedish woman named Margaretha Larsdotter claimed to have subsisted 3 days underwater, and a certain Laurence Jonas, a Laplander living near the town of Patea, was adamant that he had once drowned for 6 weeks before being rescued. 6 weeks. Bruyere was not averse to adding some other idle tales. A German lady had lived 3 days under the waterline, and a certain Gasolinus, the nephew of the Archbishop of Cologne, had taken a 15-day dive before emerging alive and well. After reviewing these astounding examples of the extreme capacity of the human body to survive without air, Bruyere declared that both the absence of a heartbeat and the absence of respiration were worthless as signs of death. While admitting that Winslow's regimen of cutting, pinching, and burning the corpse to make sure that life was extinct had its merits, Bruyere suggested a far more extensive reform of the current burial practice. There should be a system of morgues or receiving houses for the dead, staffed with competent physicians and watchmen, and financed by the state. Here, each corpse should be supervised for at least 72 hours, or until putrefaction had set in. It is typical of the rationalist, anti-clerical sentiments of Bruyere that he actually suggested that priests be excluded from tendering any services to his model mortuaries. In 1745, he presented this proposal to King Louis XV and was courteously received in audience by him. His Majesty was apparently much impressed by the Paris physician's gruesome lecture, since he half promised that the state would finance the establishment of a corps of mortuary attendants, with the express purpose of saving those mistakenly thought dead. But when the king's ministers considered the costs of this reform, they persuaded Louis XV to postpone it indefinitely, to Bruyere's chagrin. Jean-Jacques Bruyere's book was an immediate success. It was widely read and kept its popularity for many years. Bruyere himself took an active part in promoting the book, submitting extracts to newspaper editors and sending free copies to all medical academies in France. To widen its appeal abroad, he approached the French ambassadors in various countries and also the foreign representatives at the court of Louis XV at Versailles. The reviews in leading periodicals like the Journal des Sçavans and the Mercure de France were excellent, and the Academy sent glowing certificates of approval to the proud author in Paris. By the age of 57, Bruyere had finally become famous. He would remain devoted to the cause of burial reform for the remainder of his life. The only critical voice to be heard was that of the Abbé de Fontaine, a libertine and controversialist whose major claim to fame was that he had once been a protege of Voltaire's before quarreling with his famous master. In a hostile review of Bruyere's book, the abbé claimed that many of the doctor's stories of swooning ladies falsely declared dead belonged to the realm of fiction and legend. This was a credulity unbecoming to someone masquerading as a scholar and writing on a subject of national importance. He was not a medical practitioner, the abbé dryly added, but it seemed quite hazardous to postulate as a matter of physiological fact that a person could live for several weeks underwater. He ain't wrong. As could be expected, Bruyere took great exception to the acerbic attack. The Abbé Desfontaines had a poisonous pen and knew where to plant a barb. where it hurt the most, and the accusation that he had been both credulous and lacking in medical judgment hurt Bruyère's amour propre, which had been considerably padded by the many laudatory reviews and accolades he had received. In 1746, he published what was purported to be a second volume of the dissertation. This 540-page book had three aims: to thoroughly dispose of the objections of the Abbé de Fontaine, to introduce a number of new cases of premature burial, and to restore his main arguments and wait to introduce a number of new cases of premature burial and lucky escapes that had been sent to Bruyère from readers all over France, and to restate his main argument about burial reform. Jacques Beignet Winslow's name was not on the title page of this second volume, and his original thesis was hardly even mentioned. Bruyère now felt safe as the leader of the campaign for burial reform and preferred to leave the elderly Dane behind. In his second volume, Bruyère scoffed at the Abbé's arguments that Bruyère's view of death as a process rendered it unclear when the soul departed the body, and that his theory of death and resuscitation challenged the miracle of resurrection. Bruyère pompously declared that, as a rationalist physician, he rejected superstition of this kind and did not allow it to affect his work for the public good. Bruyère was skating on extremely thin ice, however, when discussing the Abbé's reservations about some of his ancient case reports. Instead of admitting that some of them were poorly authenticated, but that it was of much greater importance that he could present such a multitude of modern instances, he stubbornly defended every one of his cases, sometimes with ludicrous arguments. Bruyère devoted 30 pages to gather the evidence in the case of Cardinal Andreas, quoting extensively from the annals of the saints. His defense of the old tales of submarine Swedes was similarly feeble. He claimed that since Pecklin's stories had been vouched for by none less than the famous Danish anatomist Thomas Bartholin, it was unbecoming for a layman like the Abbé de Fontaine to doubt their truth. Bruyère vigorously marketed the new volume in his usual manner. Liberal quantities of free copies were sent to kings, academies, and ambassadors. In the Royal Academy of Angers, the poet Claude François de la Sorenay read a laudatory poem to the famous author and propagandist for burial reform. He envisioned that after the publication of Bruyère's two volumes, valetudinarians in every part of France were busy rewriting their wills to prevent their greedy heirs from having them put into the earth too hastily, and to warn their elderly and short-sighted family physicians to take care before declaring them dead. M. de la Sorenay also provided Bruyère with a curious anecdote. The keeper of his vineyard, named Gazot, had once heard a knocking sound coming from inside a coffin when serving as pallbearer at a funeral in Angers, but M. Gazot, a timid religious man, did not tell anyone about what he had heard, since he was fearful of disturbing the funeral ceremony. Voilà des délicatesses du en goût singulier. See here a singular instance of modesty, was Bruyère's comment. In 1749, the ever-diligent Bruyère had another project ready. He had revised the first volume of the dissertation, making each of Winslow's paragraphs into a separate chapter, omitting the text of Winslow's Latin thesis and not even mentioning the Dane's name on the title page. Bruyère was by far the more ambitious and vigorous of the two, and he had by this time completely ousted his original co-author. Bruyère's two-volume dissertation sur l'incertitude des sangs de la mort is nothing if not impressive. It would take a very audacious and imprudent reader to shrug it off and to claim that the risk of premature burial in early 18th century Europe was negligible. The tomes were well written and convincingly argued, although the number of cases, 181 in all, make them a little repetitious. It must have been evident to the reader that Bruyere had wide knowledge of the older literature on the subject and considerable experiences as a physician. It is apparent that Bruyere was much influenced by the memorable old tales of the Lady with the Ring and other prematurely buried heroines. He immediately fastened on the Richemondis Bon Ado story, which he had read in the travel book of Maximilien Masson as a particularly old and curious instance of rescue from the tomb. He may well have visited Cologne to see her grave under a lofty and magnificent monument of stone. In order to perpetuate the memory of her fate, there was affixed to the monument a large piece of painting in which the accident was described in picture and verse. What follows is more flattering to his determined research and his love of a good story than to his diligence in checking his facts. In the 1742 edition of the Dissertation de l'incertitude des songes de l'amour, he presented two other versions of the Lady with the Ring story. From Toulouse and Poitiers, in the extended version of his book, he offered no fewer than 7 different versions of this pan European legend, adding new cases from Leipzig, Dublin, and Bordeaux without any indication of doubting the truth of any of them or suspecting that they might have a common origin. What's this? An apparently dead lady awakes from her trance when a thief attempts to steal a valuable ring on her finger. Another illustration in the 1746 English edition of Bruyère's book. When preparing his second volume in 1746, Bruyère did his best to defend the veracity of the Reichmuth von Aducht story against the onslaught of the Abbé des Fontaines. He claimed that the high opinion of the legend in Old Cologne and its having once been quoted in a medical treatise by the learned Veltius were strong arguments in its favor. In addition, he repeated 3 different versions of the tale of the 2 young lovers in his dissertation De l'incertitude, de la certitude, des signes de l'amour. The one from the causes célèbres, one that a friend in Bordeaux had told him concerning a dashing young officer in Périgord, and one from Languedoc. Thus, there is good evidence that the Abbé des Fontaines was right. Quite a few of the stories in Bruyère's dissertation were derived from popular legends and folk tales, which had been made into medical case reports by way of various repositories of amusing stories and causes célèbres. Was Bruyère himself aware of this? He might have been, since he used the argument that an unproven fact was better than a false one when defending himself against Desfontaines in 1746. In 1749, after quoting the tale of the lecherous monk in full from the Causes Célèbres, he added that M. de Pitteval probably had fewer demands for historical proof than Bruyère himself wanted for his authentic cases. Bruyère was an author with a good grasp of what people wanted to read, and the amusing stories of ladies saved from the tomb served him well as a contrast to the darker tales of gnawed fingers and scratched coffins. But what are we then to make of the remainder of Bruyère's case reports? Are they at all reliable, or was there such a wealth of popular legends and stories about fatal or near fatal mistakes in declaring people dead? The persons of the persona of the apparently dead woman, the sleeping beauty impossible to awaken from her trance, was a subject of gruesome fascination. The attempts to resuscitate her motionless, limp body had a perverted sexual appeal akin to necrophilia, and the torments of the prematurely buried woman awakening in the tomb, as described by Bruyere and other writers, had strong sadistic overtones. A wide variety of popular legends featured more or less unwholesome variations on these themes. When researching the 1742 edition of his book, Bruyere had trawled the European literature for interesting cases in the 1746 and 1749 editions. He also relied heavily on cases sent to him by colleagues and lay readers of the original volume. This exposed him to many folk tales of doubtful veracity. Bruyère's cases often expressly state that the heroine not only survived the incident for many years, but was in full health, completely cured of the disease that had brought her to the brink of the grave, and had numerous children. This strikes a modern reader as suspect. A ludicrous example is provided by the story of Madame Rousseau, wife of a merchant in Rouen, who fell into a death-like stupor. Her doctor thought her dead, but M. Rousseau persuaded him to try every method to revive her. Her body was covered with many leeches, and the soles of her feet were cut 25 times with a razor. After the 26th cut, which was deeper than the others, she woke up and said, "Ah, que vous m'avez fatigué more," and "Ah, how you are hurting me." She then lived for many years in the prime of health and had 26 children, one for every cut, right? Another type of story has the motif that death must have his prey, although the victim might be changed. This is exemplified by the grave robber who drops dead when the lady with the ring awakens. Another version has the devoted husband or heartbroken mother fall dead from joy and surprise when their apparently dead wife or child is brought before them. Nor can we believe ludicrous stories like the one about the Count Ricard, who went into a church late at night to say his prayers. In the church was an open coffin, and in the coffin a presumed corpse. Suddenly, the dead man stood up and advanced toward the Count, his hands outstretched to embrace him. Count Richard believed in ghosts, however, and ran him through with his sword. Thus, death had his victim after all. The ending is that the remorseful Count Richard issued a proclamation throughout his area of jurisdiction that it was wise to make sure that people were really dead before they were buried. It must be admitted that these fanciful additions detract from his case, but Bruyere had aimed to amuse as well as to instruct, and to make his book accessible to the educated layperson. In fact, many of the cases were contemporary. Of these, a great majority involved narrow escapes, where the presumed corpses either had made their resurrections known in their beds or their coffins, or had been saved by sharp eyed medical attendants. These reports tend to be brief and matter of fact. They add impressive evidence that such incidents were by no means rare. Many of Bruyère's cases were attested by the local doctors, vikars, or schoolmasters. One from Dole, was confirmed by M. Charles, professor of medicine in Besançon. A troop of soldiers had been allowed to make camp in the local cemetery. While some of them were strolling about among the graves, they heard a faint cry coming from one of the vaults. These soldiers, not afraid of ghosts, promptly broke down the vault door and rescued a young girl who had been interred a few hours earlier. It turned out that the girl had been gravely ill for some time and that her matress had presumed her to have died. Too parsimonious to call a doctor, she unceremoniously had the coffin dumped in the family vault. Another sinister example came from M. Rigaudot, a surgeon and obstetrician from Douai, or Douai. In September 1745, he had been called to attend the wife of Francois Dumas in the village of Loire, but this village was quite far away, and when M. Rigaudot arrived, the husband said that his wife had died 2 hours earlier. She had been put in a coffin, and the surgeon agreed that she showed every sign of death. There was no pulse, no heartbeat, and no respiration. Her belly was grossly distended, and the husband wanted M. Rigaudot to perform a cesarean section. The dexterous surgeon instead managed to turn the child and deliver it by the normal route. The child, too, appeared motionless and dead, although M. Rigaudot did his best to revive it with warm blankets and by rubbing it with hot wine. He then went to dinner with the cure, leaving the child in the hands of the local midwives. When he came back to check on his patient, he was delighted to find the child had made its resuscitation known in a strong voice. It then occurred to him that the mother might not be dead either. She was taken out of the coffin, put in a warm bed, and rubbed with wine. Sure enough, she gave faint signs of life after several minutes of treatment, and when M. Rigaudot revisited the family some weeks later, she was working in the household, although the incidents had left her lame, deaf, and feeble minded. Had Bruyere chosen to present only a dozen or so of the contemporary cases he had collected, the result would have been a scholarly paper that made a convincing case for the fallibility of the current application of the signs of death, while lacking the accessibility to a wider audience. Such a paper would probably have been quickly forgotten. The medical establishment was unwilling to admit that the signs of death were uncertain, and the clerical establishment was unlikely to be impressed by Bruyère's anti-Christian jibes or by his plan to exclude priests from his model mortuaries. By presenting his case directly to the educated public, Bruyère bypassed these opponents, but to do so successfully, his books had to be amusing and readable. The tales of the Lady with the Ring and of the lecherous monk and their numerous variations had considerable staying powers in European folklore, and did much to spice up Bruyère's books and to find them new, eager readers. Bruyère's book was spread through large parts of Europe. In 1744, the first volume of the dissertation Sur l'incertitude des leçons de l'amour was translated into Italian. The year after, the celebrated physician Richard Mead, or is it Richard Mead, published the third edition of his mechanical account of poisons, and mentioned Bruyère's book briefly. A reviewer in the Gentleman's Magazine found this reference particularly interesting and gave a separate account of it, fully agreeing with Bruyère's doubts about the currently used signs of death. Not long thereafter, an English translation of Bruyère's book was published. Entitled The Uncertainty of the Signs of Death, it lacked the author's name on the flyleaf. It might well as have been an unauthorized translation, aiming to cheat the French authors on the profits from this bestseller. The book was a verbatim translation of Bruyère's 1742 edition, with the addition of a garbled account of the case of the lamented Madame Blondin, a Basenstroke. In the book, she becomes a noblewoman of character and fortune who is buried in the family vault. The translator further improves the already gruesome story by stating that she was actually alive and conscious when rescued by the sexton, although the injuries she had inflicted on herself in the tomb were such that she died in a few hours of inexpressible torment. Unlike the French original, the 1746 London edition was embellished with 6 plates, illustrating the dramatic stories of the Lady with the Ring and some other prematurely buried heroines. This edition was reprinted in Dublin in 1748 without the 6 plates. In 1751, a second edition was printed for Mr. M. Cooper at the Globe in Paternoster Row. Its preface, which the bookseller Cooper had probably written himself, stated that it was the duty of all Englishmen to read it and become acquainted with the fallibility of the signs of death currently used. If they did not, they would have blood on their own hands when their apparently dead wives or children were carried away and placed in so dreadful a situation, cramped up in the close and dark confinement, and forced by nature to struggle in vain for life. The third foreign translation of Bruyère's dissertation sur l'incertitude des signes de la mort appeared in 1751. Dean Tilius, rector of the French Lutheran Church in Stockholm, had read and been horrified by the French original after a wealthy merchant agreed to pay the costs for this philanthropic endeavor. Tilius translated the 1742 edition of Bruyère's book, himself adding a postscript about some curious Swedish instances of fatal mistakes at the end of life. One of these was considered particularly amusing. In 1664, the elderly Lieutenant Farling died, it was presumed, and his body was shrouded and put in a coffin. The morning of the funeral, a female servant carried some firewood into the room with the coffin. She was startled by a voice behind her, ordering that she bring his trousers and slippers. When she turned around, the deceased lieutenant was sitting up in his coffin. She fainted dead away, and when a servant led the old man into a room where a crowd of gravediggers and servants were eating their breakfast, a wild stampede broke out among the superstitious Swedes, who were fearful of ghosts. Several of them fell over in their haste to get out of the room, and a woman was disfigured for life with a pugilist's nose. The dean found it very gratifying that the resurrected lieutenant, formerly a drunkard and wife beater, became a devout Christian who spent much of his time reading the Bible. Dean Tilius also knew a more sinister instance of apparent death, which had been reported by a colleague of his, Dr. Carl Johann Lohmann, rector of Tierp. In 1706 or 1707, a drowned mariner was buried at a churchyard in Stockholm. A dull thud was heard as the earth was poured down onto the coffin, and the rector was called. He ordered the coffin to be exhumed, and the many people who had congregated around the coffin as it was opened saw that the mariner had kicked out the bottom of the coffin and that his shroud was drenched with fresh, warm blood, which smoked in the cold air. This sign, and others too horrible to mention, indicated that the man had been buried alive and died in his coffin. A later Swedish investigator verified both these instances from independent sources. The fourth and most important translation of Bruyère's dissertation sur l'incertitude des signes de la mort appeared in 1754. A wealthy Danish lady had paid Dr. Johann Gottfried Jank, teacher of medicine at the University of Leipzig, to translate the entire text of Bruyère's 2 volumes into German. In his preface, Jank, or is it Jank, who knew and admired Jacques Benin Winslow, rightly questioned Bruyère's motives in completely excluding the elderly Dane's name from the title pages of his 1746 and 1749 editions. Had not Winslow's thesis inspired the entire project? And could Bruyère really stand up and say that the book that had made him famous all over Europe was entirely his own work? Except for this objection, Jank was a wholehearted admirer of Bruyère's concept of putrefaction as the only certain sign of death. The publication of the German translation of Bruyère's book was to have profound effects. It changed the concept of death even more effectively in Germany than in its native France, and was eagerly adopted both by the medical profession and by the general public. There was much debate about the uncertainty of the signs of death and about the best way to save people from being buried alive. From 1754 until well past the end of the century, a veritable torrent of serious theses, alarmist pamphlets, and amusing books of anecdotes about swooning ladies rescued from the tomb were published in the German language, all of them devising a good deal of their subject matter from Young's translated. What's Young's? Yeah, I'm going to say it's Young's translation of Bruyere. And that's the end of chapter 3, bruv. Yeah, that's all. Goodbye.